Condemned. Julian Mercer, Book 1. Written by G.K.Parks. Narrated by Danny Holt. Chapter 1. Everything had become interchangeable. The cities, the women, the jobs, none of them was special. They all blurred together in an indecipherable haze. Julian Mercer stood on the balcony of his hotel room, staring out over the city. If it wasn't for the Ferris wheel, he might not have realized he was in London. He chuckled at the absurdity. Having been born an hour outside the city, and spending his youth at the most prestigious preparatory academies, one would have assumed he would recognize home. But he didn't. Not anymore. The woman he spent the last 20 minutes fucking opened the door and joined him on the balcony. "You got a match?" she asked, holding up an unlit cigarette. She was completely nude, her breasts barely concealed underneath her tousled red locks. No. He assessed her as if he had never seen her before. She was pretty. Ginger, as his mates would call it. Pale skin, freckles, and auburn red hair. The reason she left the pub with him was a complete mystery, but he didn't complain an hour ago. "Smoking will kill you." "Bugger." She ran her hands up his pectoral muscles, her fingers tracing the various scars that littered his chest and arms. "How'd that happen?" He looked down, trying to be polite, but completely bored now that their romp was concluded. It had been adequate, but not something he had any desire to repeat. He wasn't even sure what her name was. It seemed trivial and unimportant, so he couldn't be bothered to take note of it. .32 caliber bullet. She stepped back, maybe shocked, or perhaps turned on. Another detail he couldn't concern himself with. "What did you say you do?" "I didn't." He brushed past her and went back into the room. He found his shirt on the floor and put it on. Her belongings he carried to the chair closest to the balcony and dropped them off. "You're an asshole." She tugged on her shirt and pants, shoving her underwear and bra into her purse, and stomped to the door. "Thanks for the lovely shag," he retorted as the door slammed, rattling the dresser. Birds. Fastening his watch, Mercer glanced at the rumpled bed and felt the familiar hollow void. Maybe the reason he neglected to notice he was in London was because the city brought back the pain. Picking up the untraceable cell phone, he dialed the only number stored in its memory. After the second ring, Bastian Clark answered. "You've scared off another one?" "Baz?" Mercer was losing his patience. "Is everything set?" "Yes, sir. We move in tonight to collect the package." "I'll see you at the rendezvous point at 10. There's something I have to do first." Mercer took out his wallet, opening the tiny sealed compartment and slipping his wedding ring back on. Then he went downstairs, bought a bouquet of yellow roses, and hailed a cab. Remaining out of sight, Mercer waited for the elderly gentleman to finish uttering a few quiet words. The rain had picked up and sluiced through the frigid air in sheets, another obvious indication he was home. Sure, other parts of the world got rain, but it always felt different in England. Perhaps he was nostalgic. After the man left, Mercer swallowed, bolstering his nerves. "Michelle." He put the flowers down. "I've missed you." He played absently with the silver band on his finger, no longer accustomed to wearing it. "And I'm still sorry." The grey marble slab stared at him, unyielding and harsh. "Your dad still visits on your birthday, I see." He blinked back the tears that threatened to fall. He was a soldier, a trained killer. He wasn't supposed to be emotional. "This is ridiculous. I'm talking to a bloody piece of granite." The anger hit hard, as it always did, and cursing whatever deity might be listening and mocking his pain, he kissed the top of the gravestone like always, and stormed back to the waiting cab. The sooner this job was concluded, the sooner he could leave. Then maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. He could focus on the job and not the excruciating emptiness. As the taxi meandered through the streets, he stared at his ring.
wondering why he kept it, and why it felt imperative he put it on before visiting his wife's grave. "Old habits die hard," he mumbled to himself. The cabbie glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but didn't comment. Each time Mercer returned from a mission for the SAS, he always put his ring back on before walking through the front door. It meant he was home, and that he belonged somewhere. To someone. It was his lifeline, a tether to normalcy. But with Michelle's final breath, he had lost his footing. Over the last 2 years, his team, particularly Bastian, had tried to act as his moral compass, but often, it seemed, it would be easier not to have to worry about such hindrances. When the 4 of them were employed by Her Majesty, there were no ethical quandaries, just orders. But ever since being forced into an early retirement from the Special Air Service and becoming a personal security specialist, the lines were quickly blurring. If things continued like they were, eventually there would be no more lines. The cab halted, and Mercer paid the man, exiting without a word. He trudged back up the steps to his hotel room, planning to spend the next few hours reviewing the building's layout and memorizing the plan and at least one contingency. Opening the door, he drew his cig and pointed it at the intruder. The scent of cigarette smoke tipped him off that he wasn't alone. Constantly on alert, he was trained to decimate anyone who stood in his way or posed a threat. "I hope you sent Michelle my best." Bastian snubbed out the butt in an ashtray. "Didn't you quit?" Mercer asked as he tucked his gun in the holster at the small of his back. "That was yesterday. Depending on how tonight goes, I'll reconsider quitting again tomorrow. But in the event we all bloody well die today, there's no reason I should torture myself in these final hours." He studied Mercer, looking for cracks in his impassive exterior. "Jules, you can't go on like this. She's gone. You need to move on." "I have. Now, are we going to get to work?" "No." Bastian Clark had been an intelligence analyst. He knew his way around a gun and could hold his own in a firefight. But his real skills came with reading marks, hacking surveillance, and predicting enemy movements. He was also Mercer's best friend, second in command, and the only person not afraid to mouth off. "Hans and Donovan don't want you on site. Not today." "Who's in charge?" "Today, I am." Bastian watched Mercer stalk across the room. "Under normal circumstances, you barely have the rage under control, and with it being Michelle's birthday, any problem we encounter will turn into a bloodbath." Bastian lit another cigarette and exhaled. "Maybe you're okay with the killing, but we're not mercenaries. Minimal collateral damage. Understand?" Mercer grabbed the cigarette from Bastian's mouth and smushed it into the table. "If I'm going through hell, then so are you." "Deal." Bastian flipped open the dossier they compiled on the kidnapped child, Louisa Hamberson, and skimmed the information. Mercer had spent the entire week negotiating with the kidnappers on the parents' behalf, and, finally, the 2 parties agreed on a location for the exchange. Typically, these matters were civil, but sometimes the human element could get greedy, or the package was damaged, and things would turn ugly fast. "It's still your op, Commander. Why don't we work on the exit strategy together?" Bastian offered as a consolation. Mercer rubbed the bridge of his nose. He needed an outlet to escape. The woman from the pub didn't help. Visiting the cemetery only exacerbated the situation, and working on a mission he wouldn't be part of would just add to his feeling of impotence. "Figure it out yourself." Mercer stormed out of the room and slammed the door. Since he was stuck in this godforsaken city for another day, he should at least see if any progress was made on finding his wife's killer. It was the only thing that mattered, and despite his best efforts, and the efforts of his team and numerous private investigators he hired, no one was ever caught. The police still believed he was to blame, and on those sleepless nights when his past haunted him, he wasn't sure that he wasn't. Chapter 2. Rubbish.
Mercer exited the police station. He was in a worse mood now than when he arrived. Mercer spent hours at the police station, impatiently waiting for the detective inspector assigned to Michelle's case to make time to see him. It was a cold case now, but the detective was the same man who conducted the initial investigation 2 years ago. After an eternity, the detective inspector summoned Mercer to his desk. Silently staring, he sized up Mercer like he was the prime suspect back to gloat. It was sickening. This detective was a moron, and it was no wonder Michelle's killer was still walking free. If it wasn't for tonight's planned recovery, Mercer would have shown the incompetent bastard exactly where he could put his nightstick. But he couldn't jeopardize the current op, or expect any of his teammates to waste their time bailing him out of jail for assaulting a police officer. Instead, he procured copies of the police reports and left without resorting to physical violence. Returning to his hotel room, he sat at the table and flipped through the pages. It was old news. He read the same information hundreds of times, but he couldn't help himself. Maybe one of these days there would be a new notation or crime scene photo that would lead to the assailant's identity. But until that day came, Mercer was condemned to read and reread the file. After the fourth perusal, he closed the folder, sick to his stomach and trembling. He wasn't an investigator. His skill set involved precision shooting, tactical response and rescue, and stealth espionage maneuvers. But surely he must be more competent than the mentally impaired sows who worked for the London police. "I'll figure this out. I will find that bloody bastard," he whispered, pushing away from the table. To distract himself, he disassembled and cleaned his handgun, reviewed Bastian's plan for the exchange, and phoned the Hambersons to make sure the money was ready to go. Hans and Donovan were performing the retrieval. Bastian would remain outside to monitor the situation and provide necessary cover support. It was a good plan. Unfortunately, it didn't involve him. Hundreds of push-ups and sit-ups later, Bastian phoned. The exchange went off without a hitch. Hans and Donovan had safely negotiated with the kidnappers and exited with Louisa. Her parents were thrilled to have their daughter back alive and unharmed. "I've made travel arrangements," Bastian said. "After I collect our fee, we'll head to Heathrow. I don't see any reason for us to stay in this bloody town another night." "I agree. Where are we going this time?" "The United States. We fly into O'Hare and should arrive by the morning." Bastian coordinated their jobs. He had connections to insurance firms and private security agencies, so Mercer didn't bother to ask why. He simply agreed, assuming it was another kidnapping or ransom case. Disconnecting, Mercer showered and packed, disassembling the heavy artillery and placing it inside the checked bag. He hoped airport security wouldn't confiscate or question the items likely to set the metal detectors abuzz. He couldn't wait for approval or to send them through the mail. It was time to leave London. He swore he wouldn't return home again until he knew the identity of his wife's killer. And then he would track that man down and leave him bloodied and broken to die slowly and painfully. Bastian received their compensation and arrived at the airport, money in hand. The 4 men boarded the plane, exchanging few words. But from the worried looks Bastian tossed in Mercer's direction, it was obvious he believed the sooner Julian was away from the EU, the better off he'd be. The 4 ex-SAS had been a team for a number of years prior to Julian Mercer's forced retirement, but after his breakdown, Mercer's superiors believed he was a liability. He couldn't control his rage, and he failed to exercise the proper precautions in ensuring his own safety. When he was forced to leave, his team followed suit. Their loyalty wasn't to the Crown, it was to Julian. Even now, as he became increasingly unstable, the 3 of them were determined to keep him from coming completely unhinged. If work was something he needed to focus on, they would find more job opportunities. Situated a few rows away from Bastian and Mercer, Hans and Donovan exchanged a look. They never expected to become kidnap recovery specialists. Mercenary work was something they were better trained for, but it was too slippery a slope. Wet work was costly. After years of carrying out government-sanctioned hits and black ops missions, it was time to earn back some cosmic brownie points. Balance was important, or so Bastian insisted. Hans Bauer was a reconnaissance specialist, and Donovan Mays was an expert at long-distance tactical resolutions. They both favored a more simplistic approach to crisis management, but they were adjusting to civilian life easily enough. They were each a decade younger than Mercer, who recently hit 40, but not remotely as damaged and jaded. They hadn't seen nearly as many devastating attacks and wars, nor did they come home to find their wife choking to death in a pool of her own blood after being stabbed repeatedly. Although it was Julian's pain, it felt like something they all shared. Grief was a burden no one was free from carrying. As they hurtled through the sky, Mercer stared out the window into the darkness. At some point he fell asleep, because when he opened his eyes, the pilot was announcing they had arrived in Chicago. Stretching in his seat, he realized it was his first dreamless night since arriving in London.
"Morning,"
Bastian said, gnawing on a drinking straw.
"I've made room reservations at a 4-star hotel since these insurance blokes are picking up the tab. We have a meeting scheduled for this afternoon."
"Fine," Mercer replied. The amusement over Bastian's nicotine deprivation played across his face. "And you were worried about how well I was keeping it together." He snorted and dug out his passport as the plane made a final approach before landing. "That was a complete waste of time," Mercer remarked as he and Bastian exited the meeting. The insurance firm wanted to hire specialists to remain behind a desk and crunch numbers before issuing payouts to ransom demands. It was corporate bullshit, and not something any of them were equipped to handle. Hans and Donovan had taken off in pursuit of their own devices, leaving Mercer and Bastian to devise their next course of action. "Now what? I'm sick of being dragged across the globe for frivolous reasons." He squinted against the bright sunlight that filtered into the lobby.
"Fine. Our next move is up to you. It's your call."
Bastian stopped at the vending machine, made a selection, and offered the snack bag to Mercer, who declined, before shoving his hand inside and devouring a fistful of pretzels.
"We'll go wherever you want."
"That's the bloody problem." Mercer had taken another stab at the police file before coming to the meeting. It left him frustrated and irate. "You're constantly on my back. Give me some room to breathe. I don't need a babysitter following me around. Do you think I'm going to blow my bloody head off? Because I promise, if that was my intention, I'd have done it by now."
"You want some space? Here's your space."
Bastian took a step back.
"You know where to find me whenever you're done having a hissy fit."
"And stay away from the nicotine," Mercer called after him, "because it makes you even more insufferable than usual." Bastian made a rude gesture and stormed down the street, heading for Chicago's rail system, the L. "Good riddance," Mercer huffed. He finally had the reprieve and privacy he wanted, but now he had to figure out what to do with it. He moved through the city on foot with no destination in mind. It was unfamiliar territory, but easy enough to navigate. The sun set almost an hour ago. The air had a slight chill to it. His stomach growled, so he stepped into an Irish pub for a pint and some sustenance. To his surprise, the place was crowded with young adults. This part of town didn't seem that trendy, but maybe he was mistaken. He took a seat at the corner of the bar and waited patiently as the world continued spinning around him. After he ate and could no longer tolerate the infernal racket of the pub, he stepped outside. Glancing around, he spotted a sign for the L. Several people waited on the platform. Subconsciously, he assessed the group, determining who might pose a threat. 3 men in their late teens appeared particularly interested in the bags an elderly couple was holding. Mercer took a breath, debating if he would intercede if circumstances presented themselves. It wasn't his problem or his business, but the thought of getting to knock some punks around did hold a certain appeal. Continuing to watch out the corner of his eye, he was oddly relieved when the men lost interest in their prize and moved away from the platform. Probably for the best, Mercer thought, leaning against a support pole and waiting for the train.
15 minutes later the train came, and he boarded, taking a seat in the back corner. As he neared his stop, the brakes squeaked, but there was another unmistakable squeal. It sounded like a woman screaming. Peering through the glass of the subway car, Mercer was positive the sound didn't originate from the train. As the brakes fully engaged and the doors opened, he cautiously stepped outside. No one else acted as if they heard anything amiss. Maybe Baz was right, and he was losing it. While walking back to the hotel, his eyes darted back and forth, searching for danger, as he strained to hear any other cries for help. By the time he reached the hotel, Mercer was certain he must have hallucinated the entire thing. Had he been thinking of Michelle and not realized it? Entering through the revolving door, Mercer found the lobby empty. He went up to his room, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. Settling into bed, he shut his eyes and forced his mind to go blank. His breathing slowed, only to be kick-started by another blood-curdling scream. It came from somewhere outside. Getting up, he peered out the window, but it was too dark, and the alleys were too dimly lit to see from this height. Reacting, he grabbed his gun and opened the door. He exited the hotel and turned down the street. Half a block later, he heard it again and took off at a fast clip. Rounding the corner, he found a woman on the ground, covered in blood, and holding a man in her arms. No one else was in sight. "Miss?" Mercer spoke softly, his gun poised in front of him. "Are you okay? Who did this?" Spotting the gun, she screamed. This time it was non-stop and deafening. Before he could quiet her hysterics or evaluate the condition of the prone man, flashing lights and sirens pulled up behind him. The police ordered him to drop the weapon and surrender. Despite what Bastian might think, he didn't have a death wish, and complied. Before he knew it, he was booked and thrown into a jail cell. "Bollocks," he muttered, knowing his team would never let him live this one down. It was early morning before the police officer opened the cell door. The woman Mercer attempted to rescue finally gave her statement to the officers, although they were still suspicious of a British citizen running through the streets with a Sig Sauer. Mercer had the proper paperwork and documentation, so they couldn't hold him. After collecting his belongings and being given numerous stern looks by everyone in the squad room, Mercer was free to go. As soon as he stepped outside, he spotted the woman from last night. In the morning sunlight, he realized she couldn't be older than 25. She gave him a grim smile. "I'm sorry you were arrested. After everything that happened, I saw the gun and thought they came back to finish the job." Something about the woman piqued his interest. This was new, different, and obviously dangerous. It could be fun. "Who?" he asked. She hesitated, watching him pensively, not trusting the man who had so conveniently shown up to help. Mercer dug through his wallet and pulled out his business card, handing it to her. "Maybe I can offer some assistance." She read the card and looked up at him. "Personal security specialist." Considering her options, she walked away without another word. Chapter 3. "It's about bloody time," Bastian said. "Where have you been all night?" "Out," Mercer replied. "No shit, really. Did you find some unsuspecting American and woo her with your charm and accent? You're not James Bond. He dresses better and has a hell of a lot better attitude than you, mate." "He's also fictional." "Details." Bastian noticed the receipt stuffed in Mercer's shirt pocket. He narrowed his eyes at it. "Was it a sex worker? Because I'm not entirely certain how else you would have ended up spending the night in jail." He scrutinized his friend's expression. "Is everyone still breathing? Or did someone look at you the wrong way?" "Frankly, I'm not certain. A man was shot, but no one informed me of his condition. Then again, that happened before I arrived. It was the impetus for the screaming that led to the alley and the woman. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to clean up." After Mercer showered and dressed, he heard a beep notifying him of a new voicemail message. He listened as a man introduced himself as Carlton Road and requested a call back in regards to a potential job opportunity. The area code indicated Chicago, and having nothing better to do on this wasted trip,
Mercer went to Bastian's room and knocked. When Bastian answered, he put the phone on speaker and pushed play. Without needing further instructions, Bastian opened his laptop and performed a reverse lookup on the number, followed by a people search and background check on Carlton Road.
"Looks like he's a newspaper mogul."
Bastian frowned at the screen.
"My guy at Interpol can check criminal records, but if you want to hear him out, give the gentleman a call. As far as I can tell, he's not a mafioso kingpin or on any terrorist watch list, so he's clean enough for our taste."
"Might as well see what he has to say. Someone ought to pay us, just so you have enough revenue to cover your minibar expenses." Mercer nodded toward the emptied snack section near the fridge. "Those cashews are $20 a jar." Dialing, Mercer waited. After 3 rings, the call was answered by the same voice that had left the message. Not wasting time on questions or basic pleasantries, Carlton Road provided an address and time to meet. He did not offer any hint as to what he wanted or how he came about Mercer's number.
"Another kidnapping?"
Bastian asked. He didn't say, but it might be more interesting than mucking about around here, watching you consume a fortune's worth of chips and nuts. Preparing for a second meeting in 2 days, Mercer and Bastian dressed in their professional best and went to the high-rise apartment building. The doorman requested their names and called up to Mr. Rhodes' apartment for the verification before letting them inside the building. Another man waited in the elevator car, which could only be operated by a key, and escorted them to the penthouse.
"Chintzy,"
Bastian whispered, catching Julian's eye. As the elevator opened, the 2 former military men glanced around, uncertain if this was an elaborate hoax. Typically, they weren't invited to spend time in places like this. Sure, their clients tended to be the rich and powerful, but almost all meetings occurred at a place of business.
"Mr. Mercer?"
a man asked, entering the foyer.
"I'm Carlton Road. I believe you met my daughter, Katia, last night."
Road produced the business card, and Mercer nodded.
"Come inside. Please make yourselves comfortable."
"Bastian Clark."
Bastian introduced himself, extending his hand.
"Please forgive Julian. He forgets his manners. Why did you contact us?"
"Personal security specialists,"
Road continued, leading the 3 of them into the living room.
"I wasn't sure what that meant, but Katia said you rushed into that alley with a gun, prepared to defend her. Is that accurate, Mr. Mercer?"
There were screams. Someone had to do something. The man who was wounded, is he still alive?
"For now."
Road went to the wet bar, having temporarily forgotten the time, but reconsidered and filled a glass with soda water instead.
"Can I get you gentlemen anything?"
"No," Mercer said, fearing Bastian might ask for the container of mixed nuts sitting atop the bar. "Sir, would you please elaborate on why you asked us here?"
"Forward. I like that."
Road took a seat, making a tired sound as he sunk into the plush suede.
My daughter needs a protector. The bodyguards I've hired in the past have been inadequate. They are more concerned with a paycheck and following the rules established by the private security agencies that employ them. From the information I've gathered on you, you do this freelance. Rules and orders shouldn't apply to a man like you."
Mercer shrugged. "I have my own set of rules."
"Which do not limit you to a great extent."
Road cracked a knowing smile.
"I've done my research."
"What are you asking?"
Bastian interrupted, uneasy with the current exchange.
"I need someone who will keep an eye on Katia, chauffeur her around, and make sure nothing happens to her. Is that something you can do?"
Mercer met Bastian's eyes. They didn't need words to communicate. This was a job Mercer wanted, so it was up to Bastian to determine if it was something they could handle. While Bastian launched into an elaborate explanation of their backgrounds and work details, Mercer stalked the small space of the room, studying the various knickknacks. On the table he spotted a small cluster of photographs of Katia Road, from the time she was born until her college graduation. One of the more recent photos showed her with the man from the alley. "Who is he?"
Mercer asked, cutting into the conversation.
That's Benjamin Styler, Katia's fiancé.
Julian, Bastian tossed him a warning look. We'll get the background work out of the way after our meeting.
So that's a yes?
Rhodes smiled.
You're willing to guard my daughter?
Absolutely. Our team is comprised of 4 men, each with his own unique set of skills. We'll maintain your daughter's safety until the man responsible for shooting her fiancé has been identified and apprehended, Bastian assured. Do the police have any leads?
They're working on it. I've been told their best detectives are taking the case. However,
Rhodes shifted his gaze between the 2 security specialists.
From what you've said, you might be able to discover his identity faster. Perhaps you could remedy the situation without involving the authorities.
We don't do that kind of work, Bastian said, his tone icy. But identifying potential assailants and subduing imminent threats is necessary to ensure adequate protection.
Very well.
Rhodes stood and shook hands with each man.
Can you start tomorrow?
Mercer nodded, leading the way out of the apartment. His mind was picking through the parts of the conversation he actually paid attention to. Did Baz just agree to assist in identifying the assailant? Everything up until this point had been asset recovery, protection, or retrieval. They weren't coppers or inspectors. For all intents and purposes, they were hired guns. The American equivalent was cowboys from the Wild West, or at least that's how Mercer liked to fancy himself, having watched one too many spaghetti westerns in his day. Still shocked by Bastian's promises, he followed his friend back to the hotel in a daze. Even though Julian liked to believe he was calling the shots, when it came to the business angle of their ventures, he was in the dark. As Bastian worked his magic with the computers, creating full profiles for Katia Road, Benjamin Styler, and Carlton Road, Mercer elected to nap. The time difference and spending the night in lockup had taken their toll. Upon waking, he watched as the hotel door opened and Donovan and Hans entered. It appeared they spent the night partying. As Bastian briefed the rest of the team, Mercer listened from his spot on the mattress. Carlton Road owned and operated one of Chicago's top newspapers, courtesy of a vast inheritance left to him by a great-uncle. Having spent years in the journalism industry, Road bought the paper after being fired for allegedly running stories without performing the proper fact-checking requirements. By taking over, Road enacted his own form of revenge against his previous boss and anyone who opposed him. Obviously, screwing with Carlton Road wasn't advisable. The paper was revamped, and those he believed to have wronged him were now jobless. "Superb way to make enemies," Mercer said, sitting up. "But what does this have to do with the girl and her escort?" Bastian smiled, pleased that Julian was finally showing an interest in something besides target practice.
"Perhaps the assailant has an axe to grind with the Road family, especially since Katia is the only remaining relative Carlton has. His wife left him a decade ago, changed her name and disappeared. From what I've found, she's living in Canada, under a different name and with another woman."
"Kinky,"
Hans grinned.
"although a tad extreme."
"Regardless,"
Bastian continued,
"it would be reasonable to assume if someone wanted to hurt Carlton, Katia would be the way to go."
"What about the other bloke?"
Donovan asked, taking a seat at the desk while he studied aerial maps of the city and focused on Rhodes' apartment building.
"Benjamin Styler has been in trouble before. He was arrested for public intoxication, possession, drunk driving, indecent exposure, and disturbing the peace,"
Bastian read.
"Sounds like Hans,"
Donovan replied.
"Or me."
"The point is, he might have his own set of enemies. Most of the charges were dropped, and from what I gather, he ratted on his dealer in order to avoid felony charges. Based on the Rhodes' wealth, I would have assumed Styler could afford to buy himself out of trouble, but his family isn't nearly as well off as the nouveau riche Mr. Road. The Stylers keep up appearances with memberships to the country club and Ivy League educations,
but they're lacking a few zeros at the end of their bank accounts.
When did these legal infringements occur?
Hans asked.
The most recent was over a year ago, but that doesn't mean Styler's turned over a new leaf. Maybe he's just been more careful.
What about the woman? Who has she pissed off? Mercer asked, skimming the printouts on Carlton and Benjamin.
No one. She has no record. Nothing disturbing. She's a photographer for a woman's magazine. I'd wager her father used his connections to procure the job for her, but aside from that, there's nothing damning in her history.
Bastian shifted his gaze around the room.
Any objections to providing this young lady with protection?
Drug dealers and distraught employees are nothing we can't handle, Donovan said.
Sounds easier than kidnappers and trained mercenaries,
Hans added.
Let's not forget. Mercer glanced at the copy of Katia's driver's license Bastian had printed. She's an innocent bystander with questionable ties. She can't help it if the man she fell in love with has made some bad decisions in the past. The room remained silent, as his words mirrored more than the current matter. Baz, come up with a strategy so we can finish this quickly.
Chapter 4. Miss Rode? Mercer leaned against a black sedan with dark, tinted windows. As usual, his team pooled their resources and gained access to something bullet-resistant. Care for a ride home?
I'm not going home.
She looked at him skeptically.
And I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself.
Apparently. Mercer judged her appearance, knowing she would eventually give in and get inside the car after making her point. That doesn't mean you don't want a ride.
Fine,
she huffed, opening the back door and throwing her camera bag and briefcase inside before maneuvering around Mercer to get to the front passenger's side door.
But if you think I'm riding in the back and giving you a tip, you've got another think coming.
He held his snide comment at bay, looking smug as he went around the car to the driver's side. Some things were predictable. What destination did you have in mind? He checked the mirror for signs of trouble or a tail before pulling out, while making a mental note not to drive on the left side of the street. Damn Yanks.
The hospital. I want to see Ben.
She took a deep breath and sighed.
Why did my father hire you?
We have enough security at home. Am I really expected to have a babysitter for the rest of my life?
No. His eyes diligently monitored the traffic patterns and mirrors.
Once this situation is sorted out and the threat is removed, my team and I will be on our way.
Are you investigating?
The police ought to be. My job is far more simplistic.
What is your job?
To make sure you remain breathing.
My hero.
The bitter sarcasm hung in the air.
How convenient that a bodyguard happens to appear at such a perfectly opportune time, right after Ben was shot.
Is that an apology for leaving me in the lockup overnight? Mercer asked. She had reasons to be suspicious, but he wasn't her enemy. Is it wrong to assume you took my business card and gave it to your father? He caught her eye. You're not fooling anyone, Princess. You're scared, and you think I'm a bloody knight in shining armor. Let me make one thing clear. I'm good at what I do, but I'm no one's hero. The rest of the ride was in silence. By the time he'd cut the car's engine, she was 20 feet ahead of him, making her way to the hospital's entrance. Mercer kept an eye out, but didn't fathom anyone would make an attempt on her life in such a populated and public location. He caught up to her at the elevator, and they rode to the appropriate floor without a word. When the doors opened, she read the signs to locate Ben, while Mercer glanced down the corridor, spotting Hans sitting in a chair outside Ben's room. Bastian had doled out assignments to ensure the safety of Carlton, Ben, and Katia until they had a firmer grasp on what was going on and who might be targeted. Katia turned and headed for Ben's room, oblivious to the constant presence just feet from her fiancé's door.
No wonder she needs protection,
Hans whispered.
She's bloody clueless.
Or in denial, Mercer said. Any updates on his condition?
In and out of consciousness. They think he'll live, but they're monitoring him closely.
How'd you find this out?
I might have charmed the pants off a nurse, American women love the accent. Can't we consider permanently relocating to the States?"
"Stay focused," Mercer said, before following Katia into the room. Inside, Katia took a seat next to Ben. Silent tears fell from her eyes and threatened to streak the mascara she wore. Mercer remained standing near the door, completely out of place. He was intrigued by the number of emotions this one woman expressed. Love, fear, hope, anger, pain, and if Ben opened his eyes, a good chance for passion. As a general rule, Mercer tried to shut off his feelings, and for the most part the only one he regularly contended with was anger. So it seemed strange to see such blatant displays in front of him.
"What's your problem?"
Katia asked, sniffing and wiping her eyes.
"You just stand there like a statue, gawking at me. Haven't you ever seen anyone cry before? Are you a sadist? Do you intend to go home and jerk off to this?"
"I'm not your enemy," Mercer said. "Do you know who did this?" He sensed she knew more about the situation than she had bothered to share.
"What will you do to them?"
Her tone became cold and calculating, and in that instant it became apparent she wanted revenge. "Whatever you want."
"I want you to kill them. I want them to suffer, to scream."
The tears fell more rapidly, fueled by her anguish and rage.
"I want you to torture them."
She trembled and struggled for air.
"For the torment they've caused by hurting Ben."
She burst into loud, gasping sobs, and Mercer closed the gap between them and held her in the confines of his arms. He rocked her back and forth as she fought against his grip. Eventually she gave up struggling and clutched his shoulders, sobbing into his shirt. He picked her up and sat down in the chair with her on his lap as she continued to cry into his chest. Hours later, the pitiful mewling noises she made ceased, and he no longer felt the need to continue the swaying motion to try to calm her. Instead, he looked down to find she had fallen asleep. The emotional toll had become too much for her to bear. Getting up, he carried her out of the room and into the hallway.
"Now what did you do?"
Hans asked. "Come on." He jerked his head toward the elevator, not breaking stride. "Bastion's too concerned with playing defense. I'm still your CO, and I make the decisions. The plan's changed." Without protest, Hans followed Mercer down the hallway. Hospital security could keep an eye on Benjamin Styler for the immediate future. Inside the elevator, the ding aroused Katia. She opened her eyes, embarrassed by her hysterics.
"Put me down,"
she insisted, and Mercer gently released her legs so she could stand next to him.
"I'm sorry about your shirt."
"Oh, you mean your handkerchief?" he teased, and she looked away, embarrassed. It needed a good washing anyway. He caught the perplexed look on Hans's face. The younger man hadn't seen his boss in such a good mood in the last 2 years. Whatever happened inside that hospital room might be the first step to getting the old Julian back.
"Did you mean what you said?"
Katia asked meekly. "Yes." Mercer judged her expression. "Are you certain that's what you want? Make sure, because there is no going back once it's done."
"I'm positive."
"Okay. Once we identify the party responsible, the rest will follow," he said.
"There are things I haven't told the police,"
she admitted.
"Maybe some of it will be useful."
"Hans, call Bastion and have him meet us at the hotel. We need to work out a new strategy." Chapter 5. This was the most talkative and animated Mercer had been in a long while. He paced the room, rubbing his 5 o'clock shadow and willing the computers to work faster. Katia was seated on the bed, her back against the headboard and her knees pulled up against her chest. Bastion entered every bit of relevant data he could think of to get the technology to cooperate, while Donovan and Hans cleaned and reassembled their weaponry. If Katia was frightened by the 2 assault rifles, sniper scope, and box of ammunition, she didn't let on. "Let's go over this one more time." Mercer grabbed a chair and sat down. "You said Ben owed money to some people.
Were they his drug dealers or his bookies?
He's off drugs,
she insisted, chewing on a hangnail.
but he mentioned being indebted to some people for a few grand. I told him I'd lend him the money, but he said it wasn't a big deal.
How much?
Donovan asked.
A couple thousand? I don't know the exact dollars and cents.
Why did he owe them money? Mercer asked.
I don't know.
She shook her head.
He said he made some bad investments and needed some help out of the mess.
Sounds like a loan shark,
Bastian muttered. Mercer nodded, but didn't turn to face the other man. When I found you in that alley, Ms. Rode, you mentioned you thought they came back to finish what they started. How many of them did you see before the shooting? What did they look like? Did anyone say anything?
2 or 3 guys, maybe. I barely even saw the gun. It happened so fast.
She pressed her chin against her knees to hide the telltale quiver before more tears could fall.
We ducked into this little alcove for some privacy. I didn't notice them until after the shooting, and I certainly never expected anyone to do something like this. All at once, someone called Ben's name and said something like, "You had your chance." I don't remember exactly.
She blinked back the tears.
Then, bam!
Her sudden increase in volume made Bastian jump. Just one shot? Mercer asked.
How many should they have taken? Ben's fighting for his life right now. A second shot surely would have killed him.
Hell of a shot,
Hans said.
How far away was the shooter?
Katia looked confused, so Hans stood up and pointed his thumb and index finger at her.
Was he closer than this?
No.
Her brow furrowed.
Maybe twice as far. Perhaps farther.
She squinted, trying to recall the details.
We were walking back from dinner and stopped in the alley to...
She blushed.
It doesn't matter, but the shooter never came into the alley. He stayed at the street.
About 6 to 8 meters, assuming they didn't go deeper into the alley after the shooting. Mercer supplied, estimating the distance from the opening to where he found Katia and Ben on the ground.
Tight quarters, Donovan said. I'd love to run trajectories, especially with the angles from the buildings. Did they say or do anything else afterward?
No. Ben just crumpled and they disappeared.
A sob escaped her lips, and she swallowed.
He collapsed onto me, and I just kept screaming for help. It felt like hours before anyone showed up.
Her eyes focused on Mercer.
You showed up.
Did you call the authorities? He asked. They arrived seconds after he had, and assuming the scream he heard while on the train had been from her, she must have been out there for at least a half hour while Ben continued to bleed.
No, I couldn't find my phone, and I was too afraid to let go of Ben.
She got off the bed and disappeared into the bathroom to get a tissue and wash the ruined makeup off her cheeks.
And no one did a damn thing,
Bastian said in a hushed tone. Surprised? Mercer asked. People are apathetic. They don't give a shit.
So, we have a group consisting of 2 or 3 men, 1 shooter, 1 shot fired, no follow-up threats or additional demands, Donovan said. Shall I go to the hospital to ensure Ben isn't visited by any more of these wankers?
Go. Mercer jerked his head toward the door, and Donovan disappeared before Katia emerged from the bathroom.
I'll have a chat with the coppers,
Hans offered.
Maybe they can be persuaded to offer up their leads.
Bastian leaned closer to Mercer.
There must be surveillance cameras close by. A busy street like this with shops, hotels, and restaurants must have some CCTVs that caught something. I'll work on decrypting the nearby networks and see what I can find. Do you need backup, or do you think you can handle the young lady on your own?
We'll be fine. Here. Mercer reached into his pocket and found some dollar bills and change. For the vending machine down the hallway. You're running low on pen caps, and I know you can't afford to clean out the minibar every night.
Cheeky bastard,
Bastian remarked, leaving just as Katia returned to the main room. As Mercer studied the darkness outside, he detected a few glitches in Katia's behavior. She was afraid, grieving, and angry, but the way she turned cold and vicious in the hospital room spoke volumes. When confronted about the incident and the party responsible, she simply asked what would be done to them. She had to know who was responsible and why her fiancé was barely breathing. If not, there would have been no point in asking that question and deflecting the one he asked. Her footsteps faltered, and she cleared her throat. Mercer pretended not to hear, still contemplating his next move. As she stepped closer, the smell of her perfume grew stronger, but he continued to face away. There was something deceitful about this woman. It was important to make sure she didn't pose a threat to his team.
"Where'd everyone go?"
she asked, sounding a little panicked. Perhaps being alone in a hotel room with a strange man wasn't ideal.
"You haven't changed your mind, have you?"
No. Mercer stood in front of the window, watching her reflection in the glass. "My team will determine who's responsible." He glanced back at her. "We don't keep secrets from each other, so I don't understand why you haven't given us the identities of your assailants. You want us to find them, and we will. But why are you making this more difficult than it needs to be?"
"I don't know who they are."
She looked away, the lie blatantly obvious. "Yes, you do." He spun around to face her. "You've been handling this situation better than most. I've seen a lot of grief and the different ways people deal with it. You're calculating. Every word you say is weighted. I won't go back on my promise. I intend to exact revenge on your behalf. But no one else is here. It's time to come clean. I work for you. I was hired to protect you. Whatever you say won't change that fact." She looked angry and chewed on her bottom lip.
"Fine. I've seen them before. At least the other two, not the shooter. They were leaving Ben's apartment a week ago. When I asked him who they were, he said they were business associates."
"What kind of business is Mr. Styler in?"
"He's an online day trader."
"Are you sure about that?"
"Of course I'm sure. Don't you think I know who I'm planning to marry? You think you're just so brilliant, trying to rip my story to shreds. Everything I've said has been the truth."
"You knew the men involved in the shooting," Mercer said, pointing out the flaw in her argument.
"I don't know them. I saw them once. It might not even be the same two men. It was dark in that alley, and I was on my knees about to give my fiancé a blowjob. Do you think I gave a damn about some people on the street?"
"Classy."
"Who the hell are you to pass judgment, Mr. Mercer?"
Her eyes bored daggers at him.
"At least I have someone to love who loves me."
Her face contorted.
"Unless he dies."
She plopped down on the edge of the bed.
"I don't know what I'd do if—"
She didn't continue. "You'll survive. You might not want to, but you will."
"Why are you doing this to me? Don't you think I've been through enough without being humiliated and accused of lying? Next you'll probably say I conspired with them and that I want Ben to die."
"Did you?"
"Screw you!"
She stomped to the door, but before she could get it open, Mercer grabbed her by the shoulder and spun her around to face him. "You're angry now. You want blood, and you're willing to lash out at anyone and everyone." Admittedly, he had been testing her, pushing her buttons to get this precise reaction. It was important to discover her motivation for concealing the truth. If she was involved, it'd be better to find out forthright, but her emotions were honest. She didn't want Benjamin Styler to die. "You have to learn to be detached, unemotional. Right now you're a liability. That's a risk to my team that I won't allow. Get your shit together and file it away in a box. Only clear thinking will get us the results you desire."
"You're psychotic."
He shrugged and released her from his grasp. "Perhaps." She left the room, muttering curses under her breath. He exhaled and dialed Bastian, requesting he meet Katya in the lobby and escort her home.
"What the bloody hell do you keep doing to these women?"
Bastian asked, and Mercer hung up. Chapter 6. Hans received a copy of the police report, but there weren't any leads. Based on Katya's initial statement, the police were working under the assumption that it was a mugging gone wrong. Clearly, the woman had a tenuous relationship with the truth. The cops viewed the video footage from nearby businesses and the city's traffic cams. However, they were unable to identify the shooter. Then again, they didn't know the whole story. Bastian accessed similar footage through much less legal means and caught the briefest glimpse of the assailants. 3 men had leapfrogged the couple from the time they left the restaurant. First, one man followed, then the men switched off, and another pursued for the next block or so. Finally, the shooter took lead, and as the previous 2 men joined him, he popped off a single shot. The 3 continued on their way as if nothing happened. They kept their heads down and their faces obscured from the city's surveillance. "Do we have audio?" Mercer watched the video play again.
No.
Bastian gnawed on a toothpick.
There aren't any better angles either. Whoever these guys are, they know what they're doing.
The footage played on a loop.
I'd say the shooter used a silencer, so he wouldn't attract any unwanted attention.
Katia claimed there was a loud bang to accompany the gunshot. Again, her story fell flat.
Are you sure she isn't responsible for the attempted murder?
Yes, Mercer said, but he was developing doubts.
Just consider the facts for a moment,
Bastian said.
Katia suggests they stop in the alleyway for a tryst. She's on her knees, partially obscured by a dumpster. The men following them know where the couple dined and probably where they were headed. The killer comes upon the opening with a silencer, takes a single shot, and keeps going. She doesn't call the police. She doesn't run for help. Instead, she does nothing.
She was petrified. The shooter and his cohorts planned to follow until the perfect opportunity presented itself. Maybe they'd been shadowing the couple for some time. Maybe this behavior is not uncommon for Mr. Styler and Miss Rode. Mercer shrugged. Furthermore, I heard her screaming for help. If she was responsible, she would have waited for him to bleed out before making a peep. And in an alley, the reverb from the gunshot would have sounded much louder even with a suppressor. I don't believe she's lying about that.
But she was in the perfect position to keep Styler occupied and ensure she wasn't accidentally shot.
She isn't involved.
Jules, stop projecting. Ben isn't Michelle.
No shit. Mercer gritted his teeth and fought his temper. But you didn't see how she was in that hospital room. Her feelings are genuine.
That doesn't make her innocent. Maybe she made a mistake and regrets it now.
Fine. You want to waste your time digging through her background, go ahead. But when the time comes, I hope I can count on you.
You know I'll follow your lead, Commander.
Bastian eyed Mercer curiously, wondering what his friend had in mind. I'll be back later. If anything new surfaces,
I'll ring you.
Bastian opened several applications on his computer to run another background check on Katia Road. Mercer left the hotel and wandered back to the scene of the attack. A single piece of shredded police tape hung from the edge of the brick at the mouth of the alleyway, but it had been 3 days. No one considered this a crime scene anymore. It was just another narrow, dark dead end in a city full of dead ends. Entering the alley, Mercer studied the walls, the ground, and the remnants of Ben Styler's blood that hadn't washed out of the asphalt. Mercer wasn't a trained investigator, but he had been in plenty of firefights. This wasn't like any shooting he'd ever seen before. Spinning around, he noted the obstructed view, the close quarters, and remembered how easily the gunman had taken the single shot and kept walking. The man barely broke stride. The shooter had to know where Ben would be positioned within the alley. There was no other way it could have happened with such precision. Bollocks. Mercer hated to admit Bastian might be right. He searched the brick for markings of any kind, a stray bullet or ricochet, or even some spray paint to indicate where Ben would have to be standing for the shooting to go off without a hitch. But there was nothing. Leaving the alley, he walked up and down the street. A couple of homeless men watched as he passed them another 3 times. They called to him, asking for money in exchange for directions. He emptied his pockets and then ignored them as he continued to search. He was determining how he would have carried out the failed execution. The ground provided no clues. The windows reflected across the street, not into the alleyway. Even the makeshift plexiglass shelter for the bus stop didn't provide any viable views. It was dark at the time of the shooting, further complicating the possibility of hitting the intended target. Mercer stopped on the street corner and considered if a reflection in a passing vehicle or parked car would have provided an ample view for that amazing shot. But that was too circumstantial, unless Katia planned Ben's demise. How deceptive could one young lady be? Mercer chuckled at the thought. Women possessed a certain power over men, at least heterosexual men. The prettier they were, the more influence they exuded. Maybe it was evolution's way of making up for the physical disparities. Typically men were stronger, brutish, violent, and likely to force their point, while women had other tricks at their disposal. Unfortunately, even that didn't always even the playing field. His mind drifted briefly to Michelle, and he cursed that unidentified man for destroying the woman he loved. Mercer leaned against the brick wall and stared into the alleyway from across the street, but trying to make sense of the location gave him a headache. It would have been dark, and hard to see without the illumination from a streetlight. How was this single event conducted so perfectly? As Mercer mulled over the possibilities, he decided the only thing that made any sense was the shooter had to be a professional, either a contract killer or a sharpshooter, unless he was a sharpshooting contract killer. Rubbish. He turned and headed back to the hotel. Half a block later, he felt a tail. He didn't spot anyone behind him, but he was certain he was being followed. Detouring into a clothing boutique, Mercer browsed the racks of shirts, but his focus remained on the street just beyond the large display window. Across the way, a man stopped to read a sign for an upcoming music festival. Exiting, Mercer continued past the hotel with the man still in pursuit. Crossing to the other side of the street, Mercer looped back around and yanked the man into a small alcove next to an abandoned building. "Who are you? Why are you following me?" The man shoved himself free and pulled a chain from around his neck, revealing a badge clipped to the end. "Detective Rollins, CPD. Mr. Mercer, I'd like to have a chat with you. We can either get a cup of coffee or you can come with me to the station. Which would you prefer?" "Coffee sounds fine." "Excellent." Rollins led Mercer to the diner 2 doors down. "Thank you for your cooperation." It sounded more like disappointment than gratitude. The detective called a waitress over and ordered. Mercer declined, and the two sat, sizing each other up. "They always say the guilty return to the scene of the crime. Were you afraid you left incriminating evidence behind?" "I'm not the shooter." Mercer's face contorted into a sneer. "The family has asked me to provide protection and assistance in identifying the shooter." "Convenient." Rollins took a sip and reached for the sugar packets. "Let's pretend for a moment that I believe you. Are you any closer to identifying this alleged mystery shooter than we are?" "No."
"Would you tell me if you were?"
"No." Rollins stirred the sugar into his coffee and took another sip. He glanced at the counter, eyeing a piece of pumpkin pie.
"Since your brief overnight stay with us, we've run your history. Ex-military, personal tragedy, and now you're claiming to be a security specialist."
He raised an eyebrow, looking skeptical.
"Why don't you level with me? You're a mercenary, right?"
"No."
"Are you capable of saying anything besides no?"
"What do you want?"
"Katia's father is a friend of my lieutenant. So if you say the family hired you, then the family hired you. But I've been doing this job long enough to know when something's fishy. And you showing up in that alley immediately after the shooting smells like yesterday's catch after it sat in the hot sun all day."
He narrowed his eyes.
"Why did Carlton Road really hire you?"
"I've already told you."
"With experience like yours, it's hard to believe you're just here for protection."
Rollins lowered his voice and leaned forward.
"Carlton Road is a man of action. He knows people, and he can make things happen. I'd prefer not having more bodies to clean up. The homicide unit is busy enough."
"This wasn't a homicide. Styler's still kicking."
"Is that a confession?"
"No."
"Just the same, I'm keeping tabs on you, buddy."
Roland's words were meant to be ominous, but Mercer snorted. Your time would be better spent learning how to be a tough guy from actual tough guys rather than the cheap facsimiles Hollywood creates in shitty movies. Mercer stood from the table. Stay out of my way, detective. Chapter 7.
Oh, bugger.
Bastian rubbed a hand down his face.
What am I supposed to do with this additional bit of information?
Figure it out. Mercer was tired of this job, and they'd only been in Carlton Road's employ for 2 days. The profiles on Katia, her father, and Benjamin Styler were complete. Even Bastian's contact at Interpol didn't come to any profound conclusions regarding who might have performed the failed hit. The only lead they had was Benjamin Styler's questionable business associates. The police file Hans obtained didn't point to any real suspects, and now, with the appearance of Detective Rowlands, there had to be more to the story. As usual, Mercer wanted answers and expected Bastian to supply them.
I'll dig through my sources and try to pinpoint the connection between this unnamed police lieutenant and Mr. Rode.
Bastian bit his lip, wanting a cigarette with every fibre of his being.
You do realize it's not a crime to have friends. That's how the majority of the world functions.
It was the way he said it. Mercer's mind replayed the meeting with Rowlands. Something doesn't coalesce. Either the coppers are dirty, or Rode is. He snatched the Carlton Road file off the top of the stack and skimmed the financial records, phone logs, and work history. Based on my experiences, I'd wager it's the bloody bobbies.
Jules, I know you hate the police, but you have no basis for thinking that. They don't have a dog in the fight. What incentive would they have for dragging their heels on this investigation?
Mercer contemplated that for a few moments, then turned without another word and left the hotel room. In 25 minutes, Katia would be leaving work, and he was on guard duty. Hans was keeping tabs on Ben, and Donovan was shadowing Carlton. But acting defensively wouldn't locate the party responsible for the shooting, and that's what Katia wanted the ex-SAS team to do. The only thing Mercer knew for certain was the shooter was a professional, and since he didn't finish the job, at some point he'd return to rectify that situation. This led to 2 options: continue to bodyguard and hope to intervene before someone ended up dead, or determine who the shooter was and have a pleasant chat concerning who hired him. Katia wanted the man tortured and killed, and Mercer agreed. Bastian wouldn't be pleased. Hans and Donovan would probably shrug it off eventually, but would it change their team dynamics? Frankly, it didn't matter anymore. More important things were at stake. Parking in front of a hydrant, Mercer waited for Katia to emerge. His eyes roamed the area, searching for potential dangers. Carlton hired the team to protect his daughter. It made sense because she was in close proximity to the shooting. But could there be more to the story? Maybe Rode had received threats, but didn't bother to divulge them. Like the detective said, something smelled fishy. As Katia stepped into the late afternoon sunlight, Mercer tabled the thought and got out of the car. Going around, he opened the passenger side door and waited. She snorted, moving past him, and climbed inside the car.
Is this supposed to be some sort of apology for the shit you spewed last night?
She asked. No.
So, you're pretending to be a gentleman for some other reason.
He ignored her, pulling into traffic and watching the mirrors for signs of trouble. I assume you want to go back to the hospital? It wasn't much of a question, and she barely grunted a response before turning away from him and staring out the window as the city whizzed by. When he parked the car, he grabbed her arm before she could escape. She jerked away, scrutinizing him.
Now what do you want from me?
She asked. Were you threatened? She pressed her lips into a tight line, narrowing her eyes.
Why would you ask me that? Ben's the one who was shot. He's fighting for his life because of some business deal that went awry, and you want to know if I've been threatened?
Answer me.
Honestly, I don't know.
Mercer took a breath, attempting to be patient while he waited for her elaboration.
The magazine occasionally gets threats from lunatics. It all gets sorted out in the mailroom, but I take pictures, And most of those crazies are either psychotic fans who want access to the celebrities we interview, or are pissed by the note from the editor section.
What about your father?
What about him?
Don't play coy.
He has enemies. It happens when you buy out a newspaper and fire people.
She shrugged.
Whatever. It doesn't concern me. And that sure as hell doesn't have anything to do with Ben. You think someone threatened me, and that's why my father hired you?
Yes. She shook her head.
He overreacts since I'm all he has. But the reason you're guarding me is because you showed up in that alley, and I passed along your card and suggested he hire you.
Her lips curled at the corners.
You offered your assistance, Mr. Mercer, and I want retribution. You seemed pretty capable with that handgun of yours. Afraid you bit off more than you can chew.
She wasn't pretending to be clueless any more. She was calling the shots. Or at least, she thought she was. Their initial encounter was the impetus that led to his hiring. This wasn't about protection. She wanted blood, and believed he would do as she wished. You read me that easily? He released his seatbelt and unlocked the doors.
I screamed for help, and for the longest time no one came. But then you did, and you had a gun. There was no guesswork. If the men who hurt Ben were still there, you would have killed them.
Fair enough. The two got out of the car and went inside the hospital. When your fiancé wakes up, I'd like a few words with him.
Of course.
She offered a weak smile, and they went down the hallway. This time she recognized Hans and nodded to him before stepping inside Styler's room.
"Looks like you and the bird are getting along better,"
Hans said. Mercer leaned against the wall outside the door and checked the hallways. Aside from hospital staff, no one was around. He was unfamiliar with police procedures, particularly in the States, but shouldn't protection be provided to gunshot victims? "Do you think you can do some more digging at the police station?" Mercer asked.
"Digging, plowing, pounding."
Hans grinned.
"Maybe some nailing and screwing, too."
He caught the irritated look on Julian's face and cut his crude commentary short.
"What do you want, sir?"
"Find out why no one's guarding Styler. Then check into Detective Rollins. If you have time with all your farm work and carpentry, find out everything you can on Rollins' supervising lieutenant, and find any connection that might exist between him and Carlton Road."
"Wouldn't Baz be better suited for this?"
"He's on it. But you might get the answers faster since you already have an in. I'll keep watch on Katia and Ben until you get back."
"Right-ho."
"And Hans? Keep it in your pants. We don't have time to waste." Mercer perched on the vacant chair, his thoughts random. The only one that repeated itself concerned the shooter. He knew some of the best private military contractors in the business. He worked with a few of them. Others he'd run up against a time or two when carrying out his black ops missions. As far as he knew, none of them were working in the area. Furthermore, they weren't sloppy enough to leave the target alive. But whoever did it made a hell of a shot. After running through the usual means for hiring a professional hitman, he phoned Donovan and asked him to run recon on the typical haunts once Carlton was secured for the night.
"Mr. Mercer?"
Katia said, interrupting his musing.
"Ben's awake. He's not terribly coherent, but you can still talk to him."
Her mascara was streaked, and her nose and cheeks were blotchy and red. "Thank you," he stood. "You need not cry. I believe we are making progress, as is your intended." Chapter 8. Speaking to Benjamin Styler was like having a conversation with a blackout drunk. Instead of getting answers, Mercer was forced to respond to the same question over and over again. The only thing Ben wanted to know was who Mercer was. After Mercer answered, Ben would nod, but a few seconds later he would ask again. Mercer rubbed his eyes and stepped farther from the bed. Is he normally like this, or did he sustain head trauma? Katia laughed. It wasn't because the question was funny, and the sound of her laugh wasn't pleasant. It was pained.
"They have him on high doses of pain medication and sedatives. At least that's what the doctors said. He's normally very intelligent and charismatic."
Where are his parents? It made no sense why this 26-year-old was in the hospital without his family present
or some type of police protection.
They're on a month-long cruise. They won't be back for another 2 weeks. Thankfully, when Ben proposed, we had legal documentation drawn up so the other would have access to personal information and finances in the event of an emergency.
She took Ben's hand, watching as he drifted back into the morphine-induced oblivion. How long have you been engaged?
3 months. We were just starting to plan the wedding.
She sniffed and brushed a tear away with the back of her hand. You said the 2 men who accompanied the shooter looked familiar. You say you saw them leaving Ben's? Since Styler couldn't provide any answers, hopefully Katia would.
That's what I said.
Her focus was on the man lying in the bed, not on answering questions. This wasn't the proper environment for an interrogation or gleaning additional information, so Mercer went to the plastic bag that held Benjamin Styler's personal effects and removed his wallet and cell phone. Why weren't these items considered evidence by the police? Well, if the coppers weren't going to do anything about it, Mercer would. He slipped them into his pocket and quietly excused himself. Waiting outside the hospital room, he studied the corridors, checking for cameras and other security measures. Perhaps someone else visited Styler or inquired about his condition. Approaching the nurse's station, Mercer smiled at the woman behind the desk. Unfortunately, she wasn't willing to hand over any patient information, despite his best attempts to charm her. Clearly, there must be some trick or tactic hands used to get information, and at the moment, Mercer wished he knew what it was. Just as Julian returned to the vacant chair outside Styler's room, the detective from earlier emerged at the end of the corridor. Rawlins narrowed his eyes, but otherwise refused to acknowledge Mercer. The detective went to the nurse's station, flashed his badge, and asked a few questions. Their voices didn't carry, so Mercer could only make out an occasional word. "Detective," Mercer called as Rawlins approached. "Are you still following me?"
No, I'm here to speak to the victim.
Rawlins made a move for the door, but Mercer stood, blocking the entrance.
Step aside, unless you want to spend another night in holding for interfering in a police investigation.
Why aren't officers assigned to protect him?
Protect him from whom? You got any leads?
Someone shot him, but he's not dead. Don't you think whoever is to blame will be back to finish the job? The surprise on Rawlins' face was genuine.
The intel says it was a mugging gone wrong. Muggers don't typically return.
Who said it was a mugging? Is that official word around the station, or do you believe everything a traumatized young lady claims in the middle of the night? And since you believe it was only a mugging, why were you following me this morning and asking questions about my role?
Katia Rode gave her statement. She told us it was a mugging, but a few others overheard her speaking to you the next morning outside the police station. I'd like to get an official statement from the Vic before I draw my own conclusions. I also like to investigate my own crime scenes.
Rawlins reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Mercer.
I don't like you or your attitude, but that's not reason enough why we can't help each other out. Why don't you share your information with me?
Are you planning to return the favor?
I'll think about it.
The detective stepped closer.
Now, let me through, or I will arrest you.
Mercer entered the room ahead of Rawlins. Ms. Rode, let's go. The police have official business. Katia looked ready to protest, but the stern look on Mercer's face changed her mind. She grabbed her purse, gave the semi-conscious Ben a kiss, and went past Rawlins without a single word. Once she was out of earshot, Mercer spoke again to the detective. Muggers don't leave wallets and jewelry behind. I suggest you learn to do your job properly. I'm not trained in these matters, but even I know that much. Rawlins picked up the plastic bag, noting the watch and ring inside. Before he could inquire as to the whereabouts of Mr. Styler's wallet, Mercer left the room. In the hallway, Mercer grabbed Katia's arm and dragged her toward the nearest exit. She bucked and protested, but he didn't loosen his grip. Once they were outside, he let go. She rubbed her elbow, glowering at him. "Why are you lying?" he asked.
I haven't lied to you.
"Bollocks!" He grabbed her arm again and forced her toward the car. He opened the door, pushed her inside, and slammed the door hard enough that the car rocked. He leaned against the vehicle, fighting to keep his anger in check. When he got in on the driver's side, she was curled into a trembling ball in her seat. You told the police it was a mugging, but that's not what you told me. Until now, that detective was clueless, and no one from the police department has been assigned to protect your fiancée because of it. Your lies could have cost Ben his life."
"I was afraid,"
she said meekly. Clenching his jaw, Mercer gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Afraid of what? Who did this? I want a name."
"I don't—"
"Who the bloody hell are they?"
"Jack Pierce."
The name flew from her mouth before she could stop it. Reddening, she took a few steady breaths, calming her rattled nerves.
"But I'm not even sure it was him. I told you I don't know who the shooter is, and I don't have a name for the other man I saw."
"Why didn't you tell me this 2 days ago?"
"Because I doubt my recollection. Jack hasn't been around for quite some time, and those men, the ones near the alley, they looked like the same men from Ben's building."
Her lips trembled, but she managed to steady her voice.
"And there isn't a chance in hell Jack would have been visiting Ben at home."
Mercer turned to face her. "Why are you afraid of this Jack Pierce fellow?" She bit her lip, hesitating. "Answer me."
"Ben told me Jack threatened to kill him."
She blinked, swallowing to keep her emotions in check.
"He said I should avoid Jack at all costs because he has no idea what he's capable of."
"When did this happen?"
"Like 6 months ago. The reason I didn't say anything, Mr. Mercer,"
her speech came out clipped,
"is because I don't even know if Jack is behind this. Ben and Jack had a falling out. Ben hasn't mentioned Jack in months. Like I told you, I didn't get a good look at the guys, but they looked like the men I saw leaving Ben's last week. I doubt Jack would have been by to see Ben."
Her volume increased, as if that would make the facts sink into Mercer's thick skull.
"It seemed premature to say anything to the police. I thought if Jack wasn't to blame, he might use this opportunity to his advantage and come to the hospital and do something to Ben."
"Why didn't you tell me?"
"I wasn't sure what you'd do."
She met his eyes, no longer afraid.
"You might be like everyone else and take the easy way out. You'd put an end to Jack while the guilty go free."
Letting out an unsteady breath, she squeezed her eyes closed.
"I don't want there to be any mistake. When you get the guy, I don't want to have a single doubt it's the right guy. The thought of someone getting away with this is unbearable."
"Tell me about it." Mercer rubbed a heavy hand down his face, forcing calm rationality to take hold. He'd have to use other means of determining who was responsible for the shooting, because Katya's information was proving unreliable. Chapter 9. Bastian rubbed his eyes, exhausted and aggravated. Ever since they began working for the roads, he had done nothing but stare at the computer screen, phone in a few favors, and analyze the non-stop flow of data. He convinced himself once he cleared their current list of suspects and deconstructed the crime scene, he'd take a break, eat a real meal, and get some sleep. But that was before Julian returned with physical evidence, new names to analyze, and more questions pertaining to a possible police cover-up. Jack Pierce was now their main focus. As far as Mercer's team was aware, Pierce was the only person who ever made a threat against Benjamin Styler, although nothing that came out of Katya's mouth could be believed at this point. She lost all credibility after Mercer confronted her at the hospital about her bogus police statement and failure to fully disclose. But despite those obvious lies, Mercer wasn't willing to walk away. Bastian shook his head at the absurdity. If this was a typical kidnapping and ransom, they would have left at the first whiff of deception. But this was a brutal, vicious attack of a very personal nature, and Mercer was projecting. What would happen to Julian's sanity if it turned out Katya was to blame? Bastian cringed at the notion and pushed on, hoping to find a workable angle. Jack Pierce graduated from the same Ivy League university as Styler. The two men were in the same fraternity, interned at the same high-powered corporations, and from the thousands of photos Bastian discovered across various social networking platforms, the two were practically inseparable until 6 months ago. After further digging, he discovered their argument was over business. Pierce was recently given a seat on the board of his father's corporation, Pierce Industries. The 26-year-old millionaire was hailed by the business pages as the prodigal son. Despite a rocky start and questionable personal investments, Jack Pierce reclaimed his throne after insisting the company embark on a new product line. This dulled the crushing loss he endured earlier in the year with half a dozen bad investments.
Never mix money with friendship,
Bastian chastised the computer screen. After a couple more clicks, he learned the bad investments were made through Benjamin Styler. Obviously, Ben wasn't as astute a day trader as he should be. His stock tips were off, and his friend cumulatively lost nearly $1 million over the course of the previous year. That seemed like an excellent reason to threaten someone and exact revenge. No wonder the friendship dwindled. Bastian printed out a few of the news stories, photos of Pierce, his personal information, and everything else Mercer would want to know. Then he closed the computer and rang the commander. As soon as the rest of the team was up to speed, Mercer revised their game plan. "Get some sleep, Baz," Mercer said. "With a potential target in sight, I'll need you field ready tomorrow morning."
Aye.
Not needing to be told twice, Bastian picked up the phone and wallet Mercer swiped from the hospital.
I'll get these analyzed before we head out tomorrow.
Mercer nodded, and Bastian excused himself. With any luck, building security could protect the roads while they were at home, and the hospital security would protect Ben. The team needed a night off. After reviewing the newly gained information and dismissing the team, Mercer dropped onto the bed. Why is Katya lying? Or perhaps the more accurate question would be, is Katya lying? No matter how he turned the facts over in his mind, it didn't make any sense. She wanted Ben's attackers caught. Clearly, she loved him. But was she afraid of the men responsible for the shooting? Or was there a much darker secret lying just below the surface? As night turned to day, Mercer drifted in and out of sleep, his mind never stopping for more than a few seconds as he considered her motivation for lying. She wanted the men who did this to die, not be arrested. That would explain why she misled the police and that annoying detective. But it didn't explain why she didn't divulge the truth to him. Didn't he promise he would take care of this in the manner she requested? And what about her father? Was he an overprotective parent, or were these threats originally aimed at him, his daughter, and his soon-to-be son-in-law? Mercer sat up in bed, letting out a frustrated exhale. Carlton Road never said the exact words, but he wanted a private military contractor to handle the matter. Furthermore, Carlton had looked into Mercer's background and discovered quite a few disconcerting facts, like his former status with the SAS and his personal loss. Grinding his teeth, Mercer hauled himself out of bed and began the endless string of push-ups that signified the start of a new day. As soon as he got the chance, he would confront Carlton and Katya. Being jerked around was not acceptable.
Mr. Pierce,
Bastian called as the man exited his apartment building.
May we have a word?
Pierce glanced from Bastian to Mercer.
It will only take a few minutes.
Are you reporters? Pierce asked. No, Mercer said. Lawyers or process servers? No. Mercer was losing his patience. We need a few moments of your time. I must insist. Without waiting, he stepped closer to Pierce, put an arm around the man's shoulders, and pressed the muzzle of his cig into the man's ribs.
Bloody hell!
Bastian scanned the immediate vicinity. At least the building's doorman didn't seem to think this gesture was anything other than outwardly friendly. Fine, Pierce said, sounding more annoyed than frightened. You can have my money. Take it and go. This isn't about money, Mr. Pierce. Mercer hauled Pierce toward the illegally parked SUV. This is about your former acquaintance, Benjamin Styler. Now what has Ben gotten me into? Pierce asked, exasperated. That jackass cost me millions. Let me guess, he had to borrow money to pay back some investors, and you're collecting for his loan shark? Mafia, right? Pierce rolled his eyes. This is unbelievable. Just tell me what he owes and I'll pay it.
There's no need for violence." Mercer yanked the rear door open, shoving Pierce inside and climbing in next to him. "This isn't about money." Bastian got in the front and pulled the car away from the building. Either they'd take Pierce to the abandoned warehouse near the wharf that they had scoped out for privacy, or they'd drop him off at work. It depended upon the answers he provided. "What do you want?" Pierce asked, his anxiety level increasing now that they were on the move. "You can't just kidnap a person. If I don't show up at work in the next 10 minutes, they'll know something is wrong. The police will come looking." "Tell me where you were 4 nights ago," Mercer said. "Let's see." Pierce shut his eyes, attempting to recall. "I worked late, went to a bar after, and had a few drinks." He opened his eyes. "What does any of this have to do with Ben?" "Were you alone?" "No." Pierce shifted his focus to the barrel of the weapon. "I was with a couple of co-workers."
"Names would be useful, Mr. Pierce,"
Bastian said from the front, his focus split between the interrogation and the road.
"Where is this bar?"
"Ethan Hart and Avery Anastas. We went to Sky Bar. It's inside a hotel." "When was the last time you spoke to Mr. Styler?" Mercer asked, realizing the bar in question was inside their hotel. It put Pierce and his associates within the vicinity at the time of the shooting. If Katia was right about 3 men being involved in the shooting, then Pierce looked good for the attempted murder, although, according to Katia, he wasn't the shooter, which meant one of his alleged co-workers was. "Damn it!" Pierce wiped at the layer of perspiration that erupted on his brow. "Can you please stop pointing that thing at me? I'm answering your questions. I'll do whatever you want. I can give you whatever you want. Just stop." "When?" Mercer asked, not wavering. "I don't know. It's been a while. He screwed me with a bunch of bad stock tips. I was pissed and said I never wanted to see him again, and if he showed his face anywhere near me or my dad's company, that I'd kill him. It's been months. 7, maybe. I don't know." He took an unsteady breath. "I'll pay for him to get out of whatever trouble he's in. Just let me go, please. I have nothing to do with his deals or the people he screwed over."
"Julian,"
Bastian said, stopping the car outside a high-rise office building.
"That's enough."
Mercer nodded. The SUV doors unlocked, and he holstered the gun. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Pierce." Chapter 10. "Is it him?" Mercer asked. He and Bastian were reviewing the CCTV feeds from the night of the shooting. 3 men were visible on the feed, but the quality was far from stellar. Even though they had examined the feed before, Bastian thought it was worth another try now that they could use Jack Pierce as a possible point of comparison.
"I can't be sure. They are of a similar height and hair color,"
Bastian said, attempting to adjust the image levels in order to determine if the man on the feed and Jack Pierce were one and the same.
"But the angles aren't conducive to facial recognition. At least not the version I'm using."
"Make a call and see what our friends can tell us," Mercer suggested, checking the time to make sure he wasn't late to pick up Katia. "What about Ben's phone?"
"After I broke the password, I went through his list of contacts, recent calls, text messages, and even locations pinged on the GPS. But there's nothing sinister."
Katia said Ben owed someone money, and Pierce was under the same impression. Shouldn't there be a record?
"It's not on his phone or email. He might have a burner, or he handles deals like that in person. I'll see if I can get his business records. Maybe there's something buried within his online day trading. I'll pull up everything I can. After that, I'll check out Pierce's 2 co-workers. If all else fails, I'll have a chat with them."
"Baz?" Mercer waited for the other man to turn around. "Thank you."
"You might have to run this information by our copper pal. I've run his background, and I'd say Roland's is one of the good ones. He's not particularly highly ranked in the department, which means he doesn't cater to his superiors' every whim. It also means he's probably honest."
"That will be our last resort," Mercer decided. "Any progress on rooting out the connection between Carlton and the homicide lieutenant?"
"Not yet. I only have 2 hands, and one of them has to hold my nuts."
Bastian popped a handful of cashews into his mouth, having raided the newly restocked minibar again this morning. Mercer rolled his eyes and continued out the door,
Instead of picking up Katia, he went to the hospital and switched with hands. He needed access to Ben, without Katia manipulating him with her outpouring of emotions. With any luck, Ben would be awake and alert today. The doctors were decreasing his medication as his condition improved. Upon entering Ben's room, Mercer watched the recovering man put down a spoonful of green gelatin and look up. He offered a friendly smile, looking better than he had in days. "Mr. Styler, do you remember me?"
Julian, right?
Styler squinted, making sure he recalled the correct name, and Mercer nodded.
Katia hired you.
Again, Mercer nodded.
Before you ask, I don't know who's responsible. I didn't see anything.
What is the last thing you remember?
Are you a detective? You sound like the police officers who were here last night, and again this morning.
I'm not a detective. I'm a resolution specialist.
So you're going to solve my problems?
Ben snorted.
Good luck with that.
Answer the question. Mercer's mind turned over Ben's attitude and remark. Baz was right. There was more to this story.
The last thing I remember is the sound of my zipper and Kat's warm breath, then searing pain cutting through my chest.
Ben chuckled.
I thought I was having a heart attack, but then I saw red. She screamed, and everything went dark. I guess that's what it's like to get shot.
Sometimes, Mercer mused. Do you mind if I ask why you were engaging in oral sex in the middle of a dark alley? Ben laughed, then winced, clutching the side of his chest.
Katia recently moved back in with her dad while her apartment undergoes renovations, so we have to sneak a few moments here and there.
He rolled his eyes.
Her father treats her like a little girl, not the grown woman that she is.
Mercer nodded, no longer interested in the reason for their public tryst. I spoke with Jack Pierce this morning. He watched for some telltale sign to emerge on Ben's face, such as fear, anxiety, or unease. But all he saw was guilt.
Jack didn't do this.
How can you be sure? Katia said he threatened to kill you, and you told her to stay away from him.
Kat has a complicated relationship with the truth. She tends to be overly dramatic at times. But Jack's my best friend. Well, he was. Business got in the way. We had a falling out. He said he'd kill me, destroy me, make me lose the thing I love the most since I lost his millions.
He snorted.
There are a lot of things Jack might do to get even. He'd try to woo Katya. Shit, I wouldn't put it past him to screw her in my bed just so he could gloat about it. That's how we are.
He blinked, toying with the gelatin container.
But he would never actually resort to physical violence.
And you consider this individual your best friend? Mercer asked, clearly confused.
Yeah. At least that's how we were in college. Everything was a competition. We liked to make bets and play games. Things lacked real meaning. I kind of forgot what the real world was like when I invested Jack's money. I thought the tips I gave him were sound, but I was wrong. Jack flipped. We haven't spoken since.
I see. Mercer picked up the medical file at the end of Ben's bed and skimmed the pages. There was no indication of previous injuries, so no one had beaten Ben or roughed him up prior to the shooting. The chance of this attack being the result of a loan shark or someone collecting on a debt was dwindling. Katia believes she saw Mr. Pierce and two of his associates on the street around the time of the shooting.
Maybe. This is a big city, but we hang around the same neighborhoods. Jack and I used to frequent a few bars on that street back when we were buds. Jack still goes to them. He works around the corner.
Ben exhaled slowly, physical discomfort reflecting on his face.
But I'd say Kat's imagining things. She's never even seen Jack up close. Her only knowledge of him has been through old photos. I doubt she could pick him out of a lineup.
Mercer's brow furrowed. If you and Jack were practically inseparable, why didn't the three of you ever spend time together? How long have you and Katia been involved?
Kat and I have known each other for a while, but we didn't get serious until my falling out with Jack.
That put a lot of things in my life into perspective, and 3 months later, I proposed.
She mentioned some men leaving your building recently. Was Pierce one of them? Mercer made a mental note to ask Bastian about the surveillance from Ben's apartment. Hopefully, they'd be able to identify someone suspicious. Perhaps the guilty party stopped by to deliver a threat, or whoever was hired to commit the hit scoped out the area and conducted surveillance prior to the shooting.
Jack hasn't been to my place in forever. The only people who have been to my apartment in the last few months are Kat, her dad, a couple of investors, and a few of my business associates.
Ben pushed himself upright, wincing.
Shit, that hurts.
I need names.
Do you have a pen and paper?
I'll remember. Ben rattled off a list of 6 names, not including Katya or Carlton. When he was finished, he took an uneasy breath and hit the button on his morphine drip.
They said the bullet broke 2 of my ribs and lodged in my lung. A few inches higher and it would have gone through my heart. But it still hurts like a son of a bitch.
Well, it's either this or death, Mercer said. Ben let out an uneasy laugh and closed his eyes, enjoying the effects of the drugs that just entered his system. Did you give the police officers who questioned you the same information you gave me?
I think so. They didn't ask as much as you did. They wanted to know where my wallet and phone were. They think the muggers took them.
His speech became thick and slow.
I didn't even realize we were mugged. I'm glad they didn't hurt Kat. She still has the ring. It was my grandmother's.
Ben sunk deeper into the pillows.
Nana would be pissed if some thug had her ring. Hoodlums. That's what she called them.
He snickered.
Hoodlums in hoods.
His eyes remained closed, and he drifted into the abyss. Stepping out of the room, Mercer took a seat in the hallway and dialed Bastian. After giving him a new list of names to run, he disconnected. Katya's rendition didn't match up with Styler's. Sure, there were some similarities, but it didn't make pinpointing the shooter any easier. Perhaps this was a random act of violence. But what would be the point? The angle and shot were extraordinary. Even Donovan would have had trouble with those angles, and he was the best shooter Mercer knew. The bullet was fired before the shooter was even directly in front of the mouth of the alley. He fired around the corner of a brick wall, and the single bullet ripped through Ben's chest. 1.5 inches higher, and it would have gone straight through his heart. Ben's back had been against the wall. Frankly, it was a decent cover position to block an assault from the street. If it weren't for the surveillance footage, Mercer would have thought the shooter was in the alley and fired straight across. Why not enter the alley, pop off a round or two, and go on? Only one thought came to mind. The shooter had to remain undetected and unidentifiable, or else Katya would pose a problem, and clearly that was unacceptable. Mercer considered the possibilities. Who wanted Ben Styler dead and Katya Road alive and well? When Hans escorted Katya down the hospital corridor toward Ben's room, Mercer stood. Her eyes flicked to his face, and she offered a slight smile. But before she could say a word, he spoke. Hans, keep a close watch on Ben, and a record of who comes and goes.
Yes, sir.
Do you think someone will come back to hurt Ben?
Katya asked, her gaze darting to the room, frantic to see her fiancé. She burst through the door before Mercer could say another word. Hans looked up. What's going on now? After speaking to Ben, it seems less likely this is solely a vendetta against him. I believe someone wants to remove him from Miss Rhodes' life. Mercer watched as Katya kissed the unconscious Ben and ran her fingers through his hair. Until we know for certain, we need to provide him with round-the-clock protection. We'll cease shadowing Mr. Rhodes in order for you and Donovan to maintain eyes on Ben.
Do you think that's wise?
Hans asked. We were never hired to provide protection to anyone except Katya. Let Carlton's security worry about his protection. He hired us to protect his daughter. So if something were to happen to him, that's not our problem.
The same could be said for Benjamin Styler.
Perhaps, but I believe Ms. Rhodes would put a bounty on our heads if any harm befalls Mr. Styler. Chapter 11.
What are you thinking?
Bastian asked. He and Mercer were at the hotel bar.
Bastian hacked into the security system, but the server didn't store files for more than 48 hours. Any record of Jack Pierce and his associates had been erased and written over 2 days ago. Baz signaled to the bartender, and 2 more whiskies were poured.
"Thanks,"
he mumbled. Mercer took a swig. They already questioned the bartender and passed around photos of Pierce and his co-workers. While the faces looked familiar, no one remembered exactly what night it was or what time the gentleman might have left. The police could get access to the credit card receipts, but Mercer didn't want to ask for help. He didn't trust any cops after his run-ins with the London Barbies. Mercer swallowed the rest of the contents in one gulp. That'd be my guess. No one else would worry about Katya's well-being to that extreme while attempting to eliminate Benjamin Styler.
"So, you don't think she's a target?"
Bastian asked, reviewing the data he printed on Pierce's business and associates. Jack Pierce seemed clean, particularly after their conversation earlier in the day. But that didn't stop Bastian from performing his due diligence. From the bio listed on the company's website, Pierce Industries was family-owned and operated. Jack served on the board of his father's company, as did his brother Daniel. Initially, Jack had been booted out when Styler's investments resulted in a substantial loss for Pierce Industries. But after improving his financial portfolio and pitching a new product line to bolster sales for his father's company, Jack returned to a position of power, just in time for his brother to step down and pursue his own ventures. The information on the 2 co-workers Jack mentioned was still being compiled, but as of yet, Bastian couldn't find any connection between either of them and Benjamin Styler or Katya Road. And the 6 names Styler provided turned out to be dead ends. "No," Mercer said. "It's more likely she's the reason someone wants to eliminate Ben."
"But whoever the shooter is had to know exactly where she'd be and the position she'd be in."
Bastian raised an eyebrow pointedly.
"Jules, how would they have known what she was planning to do with her beau after dinner? From what Ben told you, things were just getting underway. From the angles in that alley, the timing would have to be perfect, or else Katya might still have been upright and shot in front of him. Are you sure you aren't reading more into this than exists? Maybe she was the intended target."
Ben said they've been having these romantic meetings ever since Katya moved back in with her father. Whoever fired that shot must have discovered this and waited for the perfect opportunity. Mercer saw the skeptical look in his friend's eyes. "This is rubbish. I don't believe for 1 second Ben was an accidental casualty. He has to be the intended target. He just does." Mercer gulped, pain seeping into his voice. Bastian's worried expression indicated Mercer was allowing his personal tragedy to blend with current events. Mercer growled and slammed the glass down. He wasn't accustomed to being this on edge while working a job, but the circumstances were far too similar, and his mind kept drawing needless parallels. Bastian spoke softly, hoping to provide some solace.
"We still aren't sure Michelle wasn't his intended victim. Jules, you couldn't have known what was going to happen. There's no way of determining whether the man showed up at your house to kill you and found Michelle instead, or if he waited for you to leave so he could get her alone."
Mercer's face contorted, and he blinked back his feelings. "Why did you ever agree to investigate for Carlton? We don't investigate. We perform recon, devise a plan, and resolve the situation. We aren't equipped to determine who's responsible or why." He picked up the glass and slammed it back down, barely managing not to throw it across the room. "Since you clearly want to pretend to be part of New Scotland Yard, you figure it out." Mercer signed the receipt with his room number and went upstairs. Just a few minutes of peace and quiet was what he needed to force the nightmarish thoughts back into the recesses of his mind. Opening the door to his room, Mercer drew his gun and pointed it at the intruder. If this had happened 2 minutes earlier, he would have pulled the trigger without a moment's hesitation. Maybe he was slightly unhinged. It was no wonder the Special Air Service didn't trust his judgment anymore. The man acknowledged the gun with a level of calm that most people never exhibited.
"Any chance you misplaced your carry permit?"
Detective Rawlins nodded at the weapon. "Shall I report this intrusion to your superiors?" Mercer replied, reluctantly putting the cig on the dresser and shutting the door. "I'd like to see your warrant."
"And I'd like to see the paperwork explaining why you think you can act like you're the only authority in my city."
The two continued the staring contest until finally Rawlins broke eye contact, reached into his jacket, and pulled out his notepad. The police department insignia on the cover added an official air to this otherwise informal and illegal meeting.
"What did you do with Benjamin Styler's belongings?"
Mercer remained silent, refusing to answer the question.
"Okay, let me ask this another way. Did you discover anything useful?"
Are you really that pathetic at your job that you expect someone with no experience in the matter to guide your investigation? Mercer narrowed his eyes. Get out!
"I've dug through Styler's background. The kid's not exactly a Wall Street tycoon. His stock tips only work about 60% of the time. Most of his investors have lost a significant amount of money. But he's sticking with the business. He works from home, moves money around, and his personal portfolio isn't bad. It's better than a cop's salary, but doesn't come close to what Katya's inheritance will be worth. Despite what Ms. Rhodes' statement reveals about the night in question, I've done my own digging into the kid's enemies and hers. Ballistics has run trajectories, and I've seen security footage from nearby DOT cams. That was a hell of a shot."
"Aren't you bloody brilliant?" Mercer muttered, hoping the detective would take the hint and leave.
"Indeed, I am."
Rawlins cracked a smile.
"I'm smart enough to know Carlton hired you to eliminate the threat regardless of what anyone says to the contrary. The only problem you're facing is determining exactly where the threat is coming from. Jack Pierce dropped by the station earlier today to file a report. It seems like you're needlessly turning over a lot of stones."
"And you possess the correct morsel of information?"
"Not yet."
Rawlins stepped closer. The two were approximately the same height, but Rawlins was softer, not nearly as regimented and sculpted as Mercer. Then again, Rawlins was an investigator, not a highly trained former military specialist.
"But I believe we can help each other. 2 heads are better than 1.
What do you want in return?"
"The opportunity to keep the death toll down."
"Who said anything about a body count?"
"This isn't a kidnapping or a ransom recovery,"
Rawlins continued.
"Nor is this a black ops mission. There are only 2 reasons why Carlton Road would hire you. Obviously, if you're spending your nights alone in a hotel room, it isn't because you're the newest addition to his personal security team."
"Strangely enough, we might have been hired to investigate," Mercer said, hoping to cast doubt on Rawlins' inclination that they were employed to carry out the wet work.
"So, share your findings since we're both investigating. I'll apprehend the shooter and justice will be served."
That's such a simplistic view of this world. Before Mercer could launch into a tirade about the ineffectualness of the so-called justice system, Bastian barged into the room. Fuck it.
"Jules,
Bastian stopped mid-sentence, noticing the unfamiliar presence in the room, but he recognized the man from the photos in the CPD's personnel database that he had analyzed earlier.
"Detective?"
He extended his hand.
"Bastian Clark. I don't believe we've had the pleasure."
They shook, and Bastian cast an uneasy glance at Julian. At least the handgun was on the dresser and not pointed at the police detective.
"Is there something we can help you with, mate?"
"I was hoping we could work together to identify the shooter," Rawlins said, his gaze focused on Mercer.
"We can trade leads. I've looked into Jack Pierce, but he alibied out." "Did you speak to his co-workers, Hart and Anastas?"
Bastian asked.
"I spoke to Ethan Hart and ran his credit card statements. Hart even showed me his copy of the receipt." "That saves us some time,"
Bastian said.
"We've been considering the possibility the shooter intended to act in a manner that would ensure Ms. Rhodes' safety."
"Bastian, silence!" Mercer snapped.
"Oh, pish,"
Bastian replied.
"We're running short on leads. Perhaps Katia had some romantic entanglements in her past that could be to blame. We aren't aware of all the possibilities. Is there anyone we haven't considered that the police department might be checking out? It's been brought to our attention Mr. Styler might have owed some crooks an indeterminate amount of money, but we have yet to establish who his debt collectors could be.
Rollins bit his top lip, briefly resembling a pug with an underbite. Are we really going to do this? Because I don't want my balls to end up in a sling if our sharing time turns into a one-sided thing. My lieutenant is tight with Mr. Rhodes, and I'm sure between the two of them someone will have to pay if things go sideways. And that someone won't be me. He shifted his gaze between the two former SAS. You gotta promise I get the collar. I refuse to stand for any vigilante bullshit on my watch. He narrowed his eyes at Mercer. But then again, you said you aren't a hired gun, so that won't be a problem, right? Right, Mercer replied, even if his promise to Katia meant walking a fine line. Chapter 12. Detective Rollins didn't have much to offer beyond what Hans and Bastian already discovered when they pulled the police records, but at least the team knew what leads led straight to dead ends. It was unlikely Jack Pierce and his associates were responsible for the shooting, but someone obviously was.
Have you accessed building security? Katia mentioned seeing two of Styler's alleged business partners leaving his place a week before the incident. She thought one of them might have been Jack, but that's been proven false,
Bastian said, pondering if it'd be easier to get the information from the police instead of having to procure it in some other manner.
The general consensus is Styler owes someone money.
Now, Rollins said, we had no reason to check the security cams at Ben Styler's apartment since the attack occurred in public. The official story was a mugging gone wrong, even if the muggers never even entered the alley.
Then why the bloody hell would you buy into such bullshit? Mercer asked.
Because that's what Ms. Rhodes insisted, Rollins spat. When we brought Katia to the station to take her statement, she didn't have any ID with her. It made her story about the mugging seem believable. A thought crossed Bastian's mind, and he stopped chewing on the end of his pen. Were any of her personal effects recovered? Rollins shook his head. After she reported her wallet and phone missing, we had no basis for questioning her story about the mugging, even though it seemed more likely that she was pickpocketed. It's possible her phone and wallet were lifted before the couple made it into the alleyway, which would explain why Katia couldn't use her phone to call for help. A couple of uniforms canvassed the area, but nothing was recovered. The lieutenant's more concerned with finding the gunman than figuring out what happened to Ms. Rhodes' phone and wallet. Bastian eyed Mercer, not ready to share his thoughts in front of the detective. Was her father present when she gave her statement? Yeah, he showed up with some lawyer. So your boss took every word she said like it was gospel. But why would Katia need a solicitor? Mercer asked. She's a victim, not a suspect. He thought back to the morning when he encountered Katia outside the police station. Even though she appeared to be alone, he remembered a few men in off-the-rack suits lingering nearby. If they were dressed nicer, he would have assumed they were legal representation. Perhaps they were part of the personal security team Carlton Road employed. But he didn't recall seeing Carlton nearby. Tell me everything that happened the night of the attack and the following morning. We received an anonymous tip of a woman screaming. Dispatch sent a couple of units to check it out. They came upon an armed man in a dark alleyway, a single victim with a gunshot wound to the chest, and a hysterical newspaper heiress. You were arrested. Styler was taken by ambulance to the ER. Katia went with him. The responding officers questioned her. She was in shock, but she explained who she was and why she didn't call for help. On account of the alleged mugging, Mercer interrupted, and Rollins shrugged. After the doctors said Styler was in stable condition, we took her to the station. Her father and legal counsel were waiting. She filled out an official police report, offered the vaguest description imaginable of the men responsible, and said you must have shown up to help since she didn't recognize you as one of the assailants.
And there was no evidence to indicate Jules was responsible,
Bastian added. Right. The bullet was from a different caliber weapon than your handgun. Roland's eyes darted to the dresser.
After you were released and Katia thanked you, you officially fell off our suspect list.
Except you followed me. Mercer's eyes grew cold. Maybe he no longer distrusted this particular cop, but he still didn't like him.
In case you haven't caught on, I'm not great at following the official line of bullshit. Corruption happens, palms get greased, and sometimes evidence disappears. It's been going on for a while. Individuals with extensive amounts of money control aspects of the system.
So why are you opposed to letting us handle this matter ourselves? Mercer asked.
Just because the system is fucked doesn't mean I shouldn't do my job. Not all of us are scumbags,
Roland said. I've yet to see that proven. Mercer opened the door. I'll let you know what we find, but I better not regret it.
Detective,
Bastian said before the man could leave.
I'd wager the men who accompanied the shooter and the men who visited Styler a week ago are the same. It's what we've been led to believe. Names or the surveillance feed from Styler's apartment would be beneficial.
I'll get back to you on that. Rollins offered his hand to Mercer. They shook, and an uncomfortable alliance was formed. After the detective left the hotel room, Mercer locked the door and sat on the bed. He shut his eyes to sort through his thoughts. When he opened them, he found Bastian analyzing the contents of the minibar. "Take what you want and pass me the bourbon." Mercer took the individual-sized bottle, unscrewed the top, and downed the contents in a single swallow. "What did you come here to say?"
"That you might be right."
Bastian shut the fridge without selecting anything.
"And now, it seems even more likely after speaking to the detective. I'll scrub some more camera feeds and see if this pickpocketing theory pans out. If it does—"
Bastian waited a moment, letting the implication hang in the air. "That means the shooter wanted to make sure he had the proper target. Perhaps Katia's belongings were meant to be a verification of the kill, which means either of them could have been the intended victim. But that was an amazing shot. I don't believe for 1 second the shooter missed his target." Bastian ran a hand through his hair.
"I'll get started on the surveillance feed. I'm thinking of a way to chart movements. I'll map it out on the aerial views I've printed. Assuming Katia and Ben had a similar routine, it might be possible to approximate locations for a strike. Once Donovan reports in on his findings concerning private military contractors working in the area, we may end up having some solid groundwork to stand on."
"All right, get to work. And stop being so friendly with the copper. I don't care for him."
"You don't care for anyone."
Once Mercer was alone in the room, he considered his options. He could conduct his own reconnaissance, attempt to have another chat with Benjamin Styler, or get pissed drunk. They were fast approaching the 5th day since the attack, but this wasn't a kidnapping with a limited window for recovery and extraction, although the longer this went on, the farther away the assailant could run. Dragging his heels on this wasn't the way to go. If Mercer did that, he'd be no better than the London police, and that thought sickened him. Tucking the cig into his holster, he left the hotel, unsure of his next destination. It was nearly midnight as he strolled down the block. His eyes swept the street as he paid careful attention to the sights and sounds surrounding him. It was a city, like most other cities, and people went on and about at all hours of the day and night. Traffic was lighter now. Parked cars lined the street. Halting his procession at the mouth of the alley, Mercer scanned for visual confirmation that would have made the single gunshot possible. Parked in the space right before the opening was a large delivery truck. In the dark, with the streetlight serving as the perfect backlight, the windshield acted like a mirror. Mercer rubbed his chin, contemplating the chances of this vehicle being present the night of the shooting. He didn't remember seeing it, but parked cars were something he had paid little attention to. Circling around, he checked for other vantage points, but nothing else showed a reflection of the alley. This was planned. It had to be. There were too many moving parts for this to not be an orchestrated hit. Styler was the target, But that meant someone had to force him into this particular spot, or else the conditions wouldn't have been perfect. Only one name came to mind: Katya. Determined to find another possibility, Mercer backtracked to the restaurant the two had left before reversing course and mimicking the path they had taken. He searched the street, remembering the surveillance footage Bastian had shown him of the three men tailing the couple. He passed several cross streets and large intersections, but this was the first narrow, enclosed alleyway. It was dark, but the area was commercial, not sketchy like the less trafficked parts of the city.
"Still lost?"
one of the homeless men called. Mercer ignored him the other day, but now he was intrigued. "Perhaps," he said, cautiously approaching.
"With that accent, it's no wonder, buddy,"
the homeless man said. He shook his metal coffee can at Mercer.
"What you searching for?"
"Answers." Mercer dug into his pocket and found a 20. "Were you out here 4 nights ago?"
"I live here. This is my house. I suggest you wipe your feet before stepping inside."
"My apologies. Do you remember a woman screaming?"
"Damn, that bitch was loud. I thought I was going to enjoy the show like usual."
His eyes flicked across the street, and his hand traveled into his pants.
"But then she just starts wailing. I had to pack it in."
"How often does she put on the show?"
"Every 4 or 5 days."
His eyes lit up, and he adjusted himself.
"It's better than Cinemax."
"I thought you lived out here," Mercer replied, digesting this new tidbit. He turned, looking straight across the street and directly into the alley, but he knew from the CCTV footage that no one was acting as a spotter that night. Instead, the assailants must have been familiar with Katya and Ben's routine.
"That doesn't mean I don't know about Cinemax. I'm still a man with working parts."
He exposed himself.
"See?"
Chapter 13. "We need to talk." Mercer barged inside.
"Mr. Mercer, do you have any idea what time it is?"
Carlton Road asked, pulling his robe closed.
"This better be important."
"Where's Katya?"
"Asleep."
Carlton rubbed his eyes and went into the living room.
"I'll ask you again. What is this about?"
"Someone's stalking your daughter." Mercer studied the expression on Carlton's face. "You don't seem surprised."
"It's been taken care of."
"Are you sure about that?"
"Of course I'm sure."
Carlton glowered.
"That situation does not concern you."
"Well, it should concern you." Mercer scanned the room, but the place was empty. The shooter was well versed on Katya's habits and routine. Based on the few facts I've gathered, I'm assuming her stalker hired the assailant to extinguish his competition.
"He said it was taken care of,"
Carlton mumbled.
"But since you've identified a threat, you will protect her. It's that simple."
Carlton went to his desk and pulled out his checkbook.
"Name your price, Mr. Mercer. I want you to remove the problem and anyone associated with this dangerous man."
"You said that issue was resolved. Now you're trying to hire me to provide a solution? I want names. Who threatened your daughter?"
"I don't have a name."
Carlton signed the bottom and tore out the check, leaving the rest blank.
"I'm sure you can decide on a fair fee."
He tried to hand it to Mercer, who scoffed at the gesture. "Explain."
2 months ago, I received an envelope with photos of my daughter. They were taken of her while she was asleep inside her apartment. The next day, I received a letter asking for $20,000. I paid, but I needed assurances Katya was no longer in any danger. So I asked one of the investigators at my company to look into the matter quietly. He was already checking into a few other personal matters and knew discretion was of the utmost importance."
"What did he find?"
"Nothing. He said it was a dead end. Katya was safe, and I wouldn't be receiving any more demands. But I didn't find that answer satisfactory, so I took matters into my own hands. That's why I renovated Katya's apartment as an engagement gift, so she'd have to move back here while state-of-the-art security was added, in addition to whatever upgrades and cosmetic changes she wants. I hired additional building security, and I haven't received any threats since. Like I said, it's resolved."
"Until Benjamin Styler was nearly killed."
Are you positive there's a correlation?" Carlton asked. "Styler's a bad seed. I'm sure he has plenty of enemies. Thankfully, Katia wasn't harmed, despite her proximity to him at the time of the shooting."
"You're a fool." Mercer turned and headed for the door. On the bright side, Katia was not to blame for the failed assassination attempt, nor was she the intended target. At least, not yet. Pulling out his cell phone, Mercer dialed Donovan. "I want a progress report regarding the local contractors."
"I'm still looking," Donovan replied. "It's been slow going, on account of trading off with hands to guard this bloke. But I've identified a handful of men who have the necessary skills to make the shot. It could be one of them or someone else. Didn't Baz tell you I gave him the list and he's been monitoring their movements and activities?"
"No." Once again, Bastian failed to disclose something important because he was afraid of what Mercer would do with only partial knowledge of the situation. "Has anyone seen Styler?"
"No one. The police have finally established a permanent presence, and they don't seem to care for the protection we're providing."
"If you encounter any issues you can't handle, tell them to contact Detective Rawlins. It appears we are working in tandem with him."
"When did that happen?"
"Ask Bastian. He'd know." Mercer disconnected and looked around. Before he could hail a cab and head back to the hotel, he spotted a light reflecting off one of the parked cars outside Rhodes' apartment building. Mercer smiled. The feeling of progress and impending violence coursed through his veins. It was the calm before the storm. And tonight, all hell would break loose. Unable to wipe the grin off his face, he went to the vehicle, smashed his elbow through the passenger's side window, and opened the car door while simultaneously pointing his cig at the startled man. The man dropped the camera with the telephoto lens and backed against the door, hands in the air. "I suggest you cooperate." Mercer removed the keys from the ignition. "If you make a run for it, you'll be dead before you hit the pavement." The man in the car looked ready to soil himself, but he didn't move a single inch. "Is there a boot release?" "Huh?" The man raised his hands a little higher in surrender. "Bloody hell," Mercer muttered. "A trunk release."
Yeah."
"Good. Open it and get out slowly." The man did as he was told, and Mercer stepped out of the vehicle with his gun still pointed at the peeping Tom. He went around the front of the car, shoved his hostage against the rear door, patted him down, and ordered him inside the trunk. Once the lid was shut, Mercer holstered his gun, took the pair of black leather gloves out of his pocket, slipped them on, and climbed into the driver's seat. He put the key in the ignition and headed for the abandoned storefronts near the docks. On the way, he phoned Bastian and asked him to monitor the police frequencies for any word on a possible abduction.
"I really shouldn't let you go anywhere alone,"
Bastian said.
"Were you spotted?"
"It's 4 a.m. The possibility doesn't seem likely, but remain on standby. Once he's secured, I'll give you the relevant vehicle information so you can start building a new profile. We have much to discuss."
"Shall I meet you?"
"No. Stay by the computer in case I need your technological genius, but send hands." Mercer drove to the building they were temporarily renting and killed the engine. Once out of the car, he performed a quick visual sweep of the area and the inside of the dilapidated warehouse. The windowless room in the corner would serve nicely as a makeshift prison. After dragging a single chair inside and grabbing the roll of duct tape, Mercer went back to the car to collect his prize. When the trunk lid opened, Mercer feared he would have to subdue his unwilling guest, but the man looked dazed and frightened. Making quick work of the tape, Mercer tied his captive's arms behind his back and placed tape over his captive's mouth and eyes. Then he lifted the prisoner out of the trunk and dragged him into the building. After he was strapped to the chair in the center of the room, Mercer removed the tape.
"Shit!"
The man winced, his skin red from the adhesive.
"What do you want? Please, don't hurt me."
"Who are you?" Mercer asked.
"John Welks. Let me go."
"Who were you photographing?"
"No one. I wasn't—"
"Bullshit!" Mercer slammed the ball of his foot down on the man's ankle in just the right place to snap the bone. The scream ripped through the room, echoing in the small enclosed space. "Want to give that another go?"
I was hired to keep tabs on Katia Road,
Welks choked out. By whom? Mercer asked, but Welks shook his head. Stepping forward, Mercer eyed the other ankle. How long have you been stalking Ms. Road?
I haven't,
Welks replied, practically pleading. Mercer made a move, but before he could inflict more damage, Welks sputtered,
I'm a private investigator.
Surprised by the words, Mercer took a step back, cocking his head to the side and processing this new bit of information. The man didn't have a wallet on him, or it would have been discovered during the earlier frisking. Slamming the office door and making sure it was locked, Mercer returned to the car and searched the interior. Inside the glove box, he found the vehicle's registration, a .32 caliber handgun, and a wallet. Damn it, he cursed, dialing Bastion.